The sound of Sebastian's laughter echoed off the glass walls like breaking crystal. He tossed the fountain pen onto the mahogany surface between us. "Thank God that's finished," he exhaled, pouring himself 3 fingers of scotch. 10 years playing house with someone who thought portfolio diversification was a fancy napkin fold. The penthouse stretched behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline that had once felt like ours. Now it just felt like his. Evelyn stood in the entailor suit she'd worn to their first charity gala, while Sebastian adjusted the cuffs of a Tom Ford tuxedo she'd never seen before. His date for the evening, Naomi Cross, heir to the Cross Empire, leaned against the doorframe wearing the smile of someone who'd already won. He raised his glass to the setting sun, his back to Evelyn as if she'd already ceased to exist. "Don't take it personally," he added without turning. "You were perfect for the man I used to be. I've just outgrown the training wheels." Evelyn's fingers curled around the divorce papers. For a decade, she'd managed his household, smoothed over his social disasters, and made him look like a man who belonged in rooms he'd barely earned entry to. She'd called it partnership. He'd filed it under unpaid labor. As security appeared in the doorway to escort her out of her own home, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity: his laughter would be the last sound he ever made at her expense. The security guard's hand on her elbow was gentle but unyielding. Evelyn didn't resist. There was a strange dignity in not making a scene, in walking toward the elevator with her spine straight while Naomi Cross whispered something that made Sebastian laugh again. The marble foyer, the one Evelyn had spent 3 weeks selecting the perfect shade for, blurred as she passed. Her wedding portrait still hung near the entrance, a ghost of a woman who'd believed in permanence. "Mrs. Hale's belongings will be sent to her attorney's office," the guard said into his radio. Not even her name anymore. Just, belongings. The elevator doors opened. Naomi's perfume, something aggressively floral and new, drifted from the penthouse. "Don't forget your participation trophy on the way out," Sebastian called, his voice thick with scotch and victory. Evelyn stepped inside. The doors slid shut on the only home she'd known for a decade. In the mirrored walls, she saw a woman in an outdated suit, holding and signed divorce papers, with nowhere to go. Sebastian hadn't even waited for her signature. He'd simply declared their marriage over and expected the world to agree. The lobby was empty at this hour. Her heels clicked against imported Italian tile as she walked past the concierge who suddenly found his computer screen fascinating. 30 floors up, champagne was probably being poured. Down here, Evelyn pushed through the revolving door into the September night and realized she had $17 in her purse and no access to any account with her name on it. The prenup had been airtight. Sebastian's lawyer had assured her it was just a formality. She'd signed it the week before their wedding, dizzy with love and trust. A taxi slowed, then sped up when the driver saw her standing there with no luggage, no destination. Just a woman who'd been erased from her own life in the time it took to pour a drink. Evelyn walked. Each step away from the building felt like shedding skin. By the 3rd block, something cold and clear had settled in her chest where panic should have been. Sebastian thought he'd discarded a decorative asset. He had no idea what he'd actually set free. The Rosewood Hotel had been Evelyn's favorite, until she walked through the lobby and saw Claire Winters, the woman who'd co-chaired the spring benefit with her, pretend not to notice her. Claire's eyes had swept right over Evelyn as if she were invisible, then returned to her companion with an animated laugh. The message was clear. Sebastian's circle was closing ranks, and Evelyn was on the wrong side of the velvet rope. She'd tried 3 more friends. The calls went to voicemail. The texts remained unanswered. By midnight, Evelyn was standing outside the Northside Motor Lodge, watching neon flicker against cracked pavement. $60 a night. She had enough for 3 days if she didn't eat. The room smelled like bleach and defeat. A cigarette burn marked the nightstand. The television got 4 channels, none of them clearly. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, springs protesting beneath her, and finally opened her phone to the flood of notifications she'd been ignoring. Group chats she'd been removed from. Social media posts already erasing her from photos. An email from the country club revoking her membership due to account closure. Sebastian had been efficient. But there was one message that made her pause. An automated alert from a bank she'd forgotten she'd opened, back when her grandmother had left her a small inheritance. Sebastian had never known about it. The account had been dormant for years, slowly collecting interest on $12,000. It wasn't a fortune. It wouldn't rebuild her life. But it was invisible to him, which made it hers. Evelyn pulled out the divorce papers she still hadn't signed. Sebastian had already moved on, but legally, they were still married. Legally, she still had access to certain information. Certain files. Certain passwords he'd been too arrogant to change because he'd never imagined she'd paid attention. She'd spent 10 years being underestimated. Sitting in boardroom waiting areas while Sebastian met with investors. Smiling through dinners where men discussed deals as if she weren't there. Filing correspondence he'd left scattered on his desk. Managing household accounts that somehow always aligned perfectly with his business cash flow needs. Sebastian thought she'd been playing house. Evelyn had been earning a master's degree in his empire. The motel lights flickered. Rain started against the window. And Evelyn Hale began making a list of every secret her husband thought she'd been too stupid to notice. Sometimes what looks like a fall is actually a running start. If you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, if you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you, and I hope you'll stay to see where this journey leads. The coffee shop was the kind of place Sebastian would never enter: exposed brick, mismatched furniture, students typing on laptops with more ambition than money. Evelyn had chosen it carefully. Public enough to be safe. Anonymous enough to be forgotten. Julian Cross arrived exactly on time, which didn't surprise her. In 10 years of watching Sebastian navigate high society, she'd learned that the truly powerful were punctual. It was the insecure who made others wait. He didn't look like a billionaire. The suit was expensive but understated, the watch subtle. Where Sebastian demanded attention, Julian simply commanded it. He'd built Cross Industries from nothing while Sebastian had inherited Hale Corp and promptly driven it toward relevance through aggression and ego. "Mrs. Hale," Julian said, sitting across from her without ordering anything. "I wondered if you'd reach out." "Just Evelyn now." She slid a folder across the table. "Sebastian is planning to acquire Meridian Holdings. He told the board it's a strategic expansion. It's actually a shell game to hide the fact that the Riverside development is hemorrhaging money." Julian opened the folder. His expression didn't change, but his fingers stilled on the first page. "How did you?" "I managed his household accounts for a decade. Do you know how easy it is to track cash flow when you're the one reconciling the credit cards he uses for business dinners?" Evelyn's voice was steady. "I know which board members have mistresses. I know which investors are overleveraged. I know which contracts were secured with bribes instead of merit. And I know that Sebastian's empire is a house of cards held together by charm and my careful bookkeeping." Julian leaned back. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person with the resources to help me dismantle it. And because Sebastian just married your niece, Naomi. I assume you're as thrilled about that as I am." Something flickered in Julian's eyes. Not quite a smile. "My niece has always had expensive taste and poor judgment. Then we have something in common. Evelyn met his gaze. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering you a partnership. You want Sebastian's market share. I want to watch his empire burn. We both get what we need. And what makes you think you can operate in this world? The question wasn't cruel, just calculating. No offense, but you've been a trophy wife. Evelyn finished. That's what everyone thinks. That's what makes me dangerous. She pulled out a second folder. This is a preliminary analysis of 3 Hale Corp vulnerabilities, complete with documentation Sebastian doesn't know I copied. Consider it a resume. Julian read in silence. When he looked up, his expression had shifted into something like respect. Most people who get burned want revenge. You want reconstruction. I want him to understand what he threw away. Evelyn's voice was ice. And I want to be standing in the room when that understanding arrives. Julian extended his hand. I think we can do business, Evelyn. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. Long enough to seal an alliance. Long enough to begin a war. The image consultant's office was sterile and efficient, white walls, glass desk, a mirror that showed Evelyn exactly who she'd been. The woman staring back wore soft colors and pearl earrings, the kind of jewelry that whispered approachable instead of powerful. We're not hiding you, the consultant said. We're revealing you. There's a difference. The hair came off first. 10 years of maintaining the length Sebastian preferred, gone in 20 minutes. The stylist shaped what remained into something sharp and architectural. Evelyn watched in a mirror as the trophy wife disappeared and someone new emerged. The wardrobe came next. Out went the pastels and the demure necklines. In came tailored charcoal, structured shoulders, the kind of cuts that made boardrooms take notice. Julian had introduced her to his tailor with a simple instruction, make her look like she owns the building. But the real transformation was happening in the rented office space downtown. 3 rooms, no windows, filled with file boxes and a laptop Evelyn had purchased with her grandmother's money. She'd spent 2 weeks digitizing every document, every receipt, every careless email Sebastian had left open on the home computer. The pattern was clear once you knew where to look. Hale Corp's success wasn't built on Sebastian's business acumen. It was built on the foundation Evelyn had quietly maintained, vendor relationships she'd managed, donor connections she'd cultivated at charity events, even the accountant who'd always liked her better and occasionally mentioned things he shouldn't have. She'd been the infrastructure. Sebastian had been the facade. Now she was liquidating the hidden assets he'd forgotten existed. The beach house titled in her maiden name because of a tax strategy. The art collection she'd purchased for the home that was legally hers. The vintage wine Sebastian had bragged about but never inventoried. Each sale deposited into the account he didn't know existed. 20,000 became 40. 40 became 75. Not a fortune, but enough to fund a war. Julian called on a Thursday. There's a seat opening on the Whitmore Financial Board. Marcus Whitmore's daughter. She's young, ambitious, and she hates that her father still treats her like a child. You want me to befriend her. I want you to give her the ammunition to take her father's proxy vote. Which, coincidentally, is the vote that gives Sebastian majority control of his Meridian acquisition. Evelyn looked at her reflection in the darkened window. Short hair. Sharp suit. Eyes that had learned to calculate instead of accommodate. Set up the meeting. Sebastian had called her a decorative asset, a beautiful hobby. He'd laughed at the idea that she could survive without him. He was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one you trained without knowing it. The rumor started in a private equity group Sebastian barely paid attention to. Someone was quietly buying up distressed assets in the industrial sector, properties and contracts that seemed random until you plotted them on a map and realized they formed the perimeter around Hale Corp's primary holdings. "It's probably just opportunistic investing," Marcus Whitmore said over lunch at the club. "The market's volatile. Smart money is moving." Sebastian twirled his scotch. "Smart money doesn't move without a face." "Who's the buyer?" "Shell Company out of Delaware. Capital." Marcus shrugged. "Probably some hedge fund playing the long game." Capital. The initials meant nothing to Sebastian. Why would they? He'd never paid attention to Evelyn's maiden name. Evelyn Harper had ceased to exist the day she became Mrs. Hale, and Mrs. Hale had ceased to exist the day he'd signed the papers. He'd seen her exactly once since the divorce, 3 weeks ago, walking past his favorite restaurant. She'd looked different, harder somehow, thinner, her hair short in a way that seemed almost aggressive. He'd considered approaching her, maybe offering to buy her dinner for old time's sake. But Naomi had been on his arm, and there was no point in nostalgia. Besides, Evelyn had probably found some middle management type to console her. Someone grateful for her domestic skills and undemanding company. Someone who'd never understand what Sebastian had walked away from because there'd been nothing to understand. She'd been pleasant background music to his symphony. The waiter brought another round. Marcus was talking about his daughter again, complaining that Elena wanted a real role in the company instead of the decorative title he'd given her. "These kids don't understand patience," he said. Sebastian nodded agreement, but his mind was elsewhere. The Meridian deal was taking longer to close than projected. 2 board members who'd promised votes were suddenly reconsidering their options. His lead investor had postponed their last meeting. Small things. Meaningless things. But they were happening with increasing frequency, and Sebastian had built his empire on reading patterns. "This Capital," he said. "Are they bidding against us on anything?" "Not directly. They seem focused on secondary markets. Support infrastructure." Marcus paused. "Although now that you mention it, they did acquire the shipping contract we were negotiating for the Riverside project. Outbid us by 2%. 2%. Just enough to sting. Just enough to matter." Sebastian set down his glass. "I want a full report on every move they've made. Every property, every contract, every shell company they're hiding behind." "You think someone's targeting you?" "I think someone's playing a game, and I don't like being a piece on someone else's board." Marcus laughed. "Paranoia doesn't suit you, Sebastian. You're too successful to have real enemies." But success, Sebastian was beginning to understand, was exactly what made you a target. And somewhere in the city, someone was circling his empire like a shark that had scented blood in the water. He just couldn't see the teeth yet. The Wall Street Journal article appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried on page 6 of the business section. Small enough that casual readers would miss it. Prominent enough that the people who mattered would notice. Whitmore Financial under investigation for undisclosed conflicts of interest. The details were vague but damning. Anonymous sources. Regulatory inquiries. Questions about Marcus Whitmore's relationship with certain offshore accounts that may or may not have influenced his investment recommendations. Marcus called Sebastian before breakfast. "This is a hit piece. Someone fed them information. Can you prove the allegations are false?" Silence. "Then, the optics are complicated." Optics. The word men like Marcus used when they meant guilty but manageable. Sebastian felt the first flutter of real concern. "Marcus, the Meridian vote is next week. If you're compromised." "I'm not compromised. It's a smear campaign. I'll handle it. But handling it took time. The SEC opened an inquiry. Marcus's lawyer advised him to recuse himself from any votes that could be perceived as conflicts of interest. And just like that, Sebastian lost the proxy vote that would have given him control of Meridian Holdings. The deal didn't die. It just stalled. Which in business was often the same thing. Sebastian stood in his office, watching the city stretch below him, and tried to identify the enemy. Capital had been quiet lately, no new acquisitions, no aggressive moves. Maybe they weren't connected. Maybe this was just bad luck and worse timing. His phone buzzed. An email from an unfamiliar address, no subject line. The thing about houses of cards is they look impressive until someone pulls the right piece. Consider this a courtesy warning. The foundation you're standing on isn't as solid as you think. A former architect. Sebastian read it 3 times. A prank. Had to be. Disgruntled employee, maybe, or a competitor playing mind games. But something in the phrasing bothered him. Former architect. He'd used that exact phrase once, years ago, to describe Evelyn's role in their marriage. "You're the architect of our home," he'd said, "and I'm the builder of our future." She'd smiled like it was a compliment. He'd meant it as a dismissal. Sebastian deleted the email and poured himself a drink. It was 3 in the afternoon, but the Meridian deal was slipping through his fingers, Marcus was toxic, and someone somewhere was playing a game he didn't understand. The scotch burned less than the growing suspicion that he'd missed something important. That in the 3 months since he'd freed himself from the weight of a marriage that had served its purpose, something had shifted in the world around him. But that was impossible. Evelyn was gone. His empire was secure. And paranoia, as Marcus had said, didn't suit him. He'd learned that much about survival: never let them see you doubt. Even when the ground beneath you starts to crack. Even when you're standing on ruins and calling it a kingdom. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are the only thing holding us together, but what happens when someone else starts writing the narrative? If you've been following this journey, if you felt Evelyn's transformation resonate with something in your own life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. These moments of reckoning are rarely simple, and your perspective matters. The Riverside development was Sebastian's legacy project, a mixed-use complex that would reshape the downtown skyline and cement his reputation as a visionary. The groundbreaking had been delayed twice. The permits had taken 8 months longer than projected. But the real problem was the money. Construction costs had exceeded budget by 30%. The lead contractor had quit after a payment dispute. And now, 3 of his primary investors were backing out, citing market uncertainty and portfolio rebalancing. Which was corporate speak for, "We don't trust you anymore." Sebastian sat in his office at 11 p.m., spreadsheets glowing on 3 monitors, and tried to find the capital to keep the project from imploding. The numbers didn't work. No matter how he adjusted the projections, the gap was too wide. He needed someone who understood the financial architecture of his company. Someone who'd seen the whole picture, who knew which accounts could be tapped, which relationships could be leveraged. His phone sat on the desk, Evelyn's contact still saved. He hadn't deleted it, why would he? She'd been part of his infrastructure for a decade. Useful. Efficient. He dialed before he could reconsider. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." Sebastian tried again. Same recording. She'd changed her number. Hadn't even kept the phone he'd paid for, apparently. Fine. He'd reach out another way. Her email bounced back. Her social media accounts had been deactivated. The friends they'd shared, his friends, really, claimed they hadn't seen her. It was as if Evelyn Hale had simply vanished the moment she'd walked out of the penthouse. Which should have been a relief. Clean break. No lingering obligations. Except now he needed her, and she'd made herself unfindable. Calling in old favors. Naomi's voice came from the doorway. She was wearing one of his dress shirts and nothing else, playing at domesticity in a way that felt performative compared to Evelyn's effortless competence. Just solving a problem. The problem being that you're hemorrhaging money on a project that was supposed to make you look like a genius. Naomi crossed to the bar, poured herself wine. Daddy says you should cut your losses. Sell the land while it's still worth something. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Your father doesn't understand vision. My father understands profit. She sipped, smiled. But don't worry. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do. The confidence in her voice felt like mockery. As if she knew something he didn't. As if the whole world was watching him struggle and calling it entertainment. After Naomi retreated to the bedroom, Sebastian pulled up the files on Capital. The shell company had been quiet for 3 weeks, no acquisitions, no moves. But their previous purchases formed a pattern now that he could see it. Every asset they'd acquired was something Sebastian had either wanted or needed. Support infrastructure for his projects. Contracts with vendors he relied on. Property adjacent to his developments. They weren't randomly investing. They were building a cage around him. And whoever was behind Capital knew exactly where his pressure points were. Sebastian reached for his phone again, then stopped. The email from the former architect sat in his deleted folder. He restored it, read it again. The foundation you're standing on isn't as solid as you think. Foundations. Infrastructure. Architecture. The language of someone who'd spent a decade watching him build an empire from the inside. He told himself it was impossible. Evelyn didn't have the resources or knowledge to operate at this level. She'd been a housewife playing at sophistication, nothing more. But a small voice in the back of his mind, the voice he'd learned to ignore, whispered that he'd been wrong about other things before. And that sometimes the most dangerous mistake was assuming competence was the same as visibility. The Hale Cross Charitable Foundation Gala was supposed to be Sebastian's resurrection. 600 guests. Every power player in the city. The perfect stage to announce that despite recent setbacks, Hale Corp remained a dominant force. He'd spent $40,000 on the event. Custom lighting. An orchestra. Champagne from his private collection, except the collection had been smaller than he remembered, something about a wine auction Evelyn had managed years ago that he'd never followed up on. Naomi glided beside him in a gown that cost more than most people's cars, her hand possessive on his arm. The Cross name had opened doors his own reputation had started to close. Her uncle Julian had even agreed to make an appearance, which Sebastian took as a sign that the tide was turning. Mr. Hale. A reporter from the Business Journal. Can you comment on the rumors that you're seeking emergency financing for the Riverside project? Rumors are for people who don't understand vision, Sebastian said smoothly. Hale Corp is strategically positioning for the next phase of growth. The reporter scribbled notes that probably translated to no comment. Sebastian moved on, working the room with practiced charm. But something felt off. Conversation stopped when he approached. Smiles were polite but hollow. Even Marcus Whitmore, supposedly cleared of any wrongdoing, was avoiding eye contact. Then Julian Cross took the stage. Thank you all for coming tonight. Before we begin the program, I'd like to introduce someone special. A new partner in Cross Industries, and the primary architect of our recent strategic expansion. Sebastian felt Naomi stiffen beside him. On stage, the spotlight shifted to the wings. Evelyn walked out. Not the Evelyn he'd discarded. This woman wore midnight blue, her hair sculpted, her posture commanding. She moved like someone who owned the room because she did. The gala was being held in a hotel that, Sebastian suddenly realized, had been acquired last month by Capital. "Many of you knew me as Mrs. Hale," Evelyn said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "I managed households and charitable events. I smiled at dinners where business was discussed as if I weren't there. I was told I was a decorative asset in a world that required substance." She paused, her eyes finding Sebastian across the crowd. "But here's what I learned in 10 years of being underestimated: people tell you everything when they think you're not listening. And the most valuable information comes from those who don't believe you're smart enough to use it." Julian stepped forward. "Ms. Harper, Evelyn has provided strategic insight that's allowed cross-industries to acquire key assets in markets we'd previously struggled to enter. She's proven that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's demonstrating exactly what someone threw away." The room erupted in polite applause. Sebastian stood frozen, Naomi's nails digging into his arm. Around him, he could feel the shift, the way power players were reassessing, the way eyes that had looked through Evelyn 3 months ago were now locked on her with respect. She descended from the stage, moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations. She didn't look at Sebastian. She didn't have to. Her presence was the message. When she finally passed within speaking distance, Sebastian found his voice. "This is quite a performance." "It's not a performance, Sebastian." Evelyn's smile was ice. "It's a demonstration. Everything you built, I maintained. And now you're going to learn what happens when the infrastructure walks away. You're bluffing. You don't have the resources to." "The Riverside project," she interrupted softly. "The contractors who quit. I hired them. The investors who backed out. I showed them the real numbers. The foundation you're standing on. I poured it. And I know exactly which support beam to remove to bring the whole thing down." Sebastian's vision tunneled. Around them, the gala continued, oblivious. "Why?" "Because you laughed." Evelyn's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Because you looked at 10 years of partnership and called it a hobby. Because you thought I was too stupid to survive without you." She leaned closer. "And because I wanted you to see my face when you realized what you'd done." She walked away. Julian offered her his arm, and they moved toward a cluster of investors who used to be Sebastian's. Naomi whispered something about leaving, but Sebastian couldn't move. He was watching his empire realign around a woman he discarded like an outdated accessory. The foundation was cracking. And he was still standing on it, pretending not to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. The private anteroom behind the ballroom was meant for donor meetings and quiet negotiations. Sebastian had demanded access, pulled every favor he had left, and finally cornered Evelyn between the silent auction and the closing remarks. Julian stood near the door, watching with the expression of someone observing an experiment. "You have 5 minutes," he said to Sebastian. "Then security escorts you out." "I don't need security." Evelyn's voice was calm. "He's not dangerous. Just desperate." The word landed like a slap. Sebastian straightened his tie, tried to summon the confidence that had carried him through 1,000 boardrooms. "This doesn't have to be adversarial. We can work something out." "Work what out, exactly?" "The Riverside project." "You're right, the numbers are tight. But if you provide bridge financing, I can make you whole plus 15%. 20 if you want equity." Evelyn sat in a wingback chair, crossed her legs. She looked like she was conducting an interview, not being propositioned by the man who divorced her 3 months ago. Why would I do that? Because you're angry, and I understand that. But destroying Hale Corp doesn't benefit you. If you let me rebuild, we both profit. You've made your point, Evelyn. You've proven you're smarter than I gave you credit for. Now let's be adults about this. The speech had sounded better in his head. In his office, pacing at midnight, it had seemed reasonable. Here, watching Evelyn's expression remain completely neutral, it sounded like begging. Sebastian. She leaned forward. Do you remember what you said when you handed me the divorce papers? You told me I was perfect for the man you used to be. As if I was a phase. A learning experience. Something you'd outgrown. I was drunk. It came out wrong. It came out honest. Evelyn's voice didn't rise. For 10 years, I managed your life. I cultivated relationships you took credit for. I smoothed over your mistakes. I made you look like you deserved the empire you inherited. And you never once said thank you. You said, that's what wives do. Sebastian felt something crack in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or the last vestige of the belief that he'd been the architect of his own success. I need your help. I know. I'm asking. Evelyn, I'm asking. Name your price. She stood, moved to the window overlooking the ballroom. Below, the gala continued. People laughed, networked, conducted business. The world moving forward while Sebastian's was collapsing. There's no price, Sebastian. Because I'm not negotiating with hobbies. His own words. Thrown back like acid. Sebastian felt his knees weaken, felt himself actually sinking toward the floor in a way that would have been humiliating if there'd been anyone left to see. Please. You know what the real tragedy is? Evelyn turned from the window. If you treated me like a partner instead of an ornament, I would have helped you. If you'd asked instead of demanded, I would have stayed. But you didn't. You laughed. You threw away something irreplaceable because you couldn't see its value. I see it now. Too late. She moved toward the door. Julian opened it, and the sound of the gala rushed in, music and voices and life continuing without Sebastian at the center. The feds are waiting for you in the lobby, by the way. Something about financial irregularities Marcus Whitmore mentioned to avoid his own charges. Apparently, some of those offshore accounts had your signatures on them. Sebastian's blood froze. You set me up. I documented what already existed. The difference is, I understand the difference between building something and just taking credit for it. Evelyn paused in the doorway. Goodbye, Sebastian. I hope whatever you found in that glass of scotch was worth it. She left. Julian followed. And Sebastian knelt on imported carpet in an empty room, hearing sirens in the distance, and finally understood what he'd lost. Not a wife. Not a decorative asset. But the only person who'd ever known how to hold his world together. The foundation hadn't cracked. It had walked away. And he'd been too arrogant to notice until there was nothing left to stand on. The office had corner windows and a view that stretched to the harbor. Evelyn stood at the glass, watching sailboats cut through water that reflected the winter sky. 3 months since the gala. 3 months since she'd watched Sebastian being escorted out of a building he'd once owned shares in. The Riverside project had been liquidated. The property sold at auction. Hale Corp existed now only as a cautionary tale in business school case studies, how arrogance and poor infrastructure could topple even an inherited empire. Cross Industries, by contrast, had acquired strategic assets at favorable prices. Evelyn's official title was Chief Strategic Advisor, but everyone knew she was the architect behind their recent expansion. The woman who turned household management into corporate warfare. Her assistant knocked. "This came for you." Personal delivery. The envelope was expensive stationery, forwarded from a federal prison in Pennsylvania. No return address, but Evelyn recognized the handwriting. She'd seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the divorce papers he'd tossed at her like trash. She held the letter over the shredder, felt the weight of it. Sebastian had been convicted of fraud and tax evasion, charges that had been built on evidence she'd helped compile, but crimes he'd actually committed. She hadn't destroyed an innocent man. She'd simply removed the smoke and mirrors that had hidden a guilty one. The shredder hummed, waiting. Evelyn thought about reading it. About giving Sebastian the last word, the final plea, whatever justification or apology or curse he'd written from behind bars. But she'd spent 10 years listening to him talk. 10 years centering his needs, his dreams, his vision of the world. She was done listening. The letter went into the shredder. The machine chewed it into strips of meaningless paper. And Evelyn turned back to the window, to the city that had once felt like his, to the empire she'd helped build and then had to destroy to finally claim her own. Her phone buzzed. Julian, asking if she wanted to join the board meeting discussing their next acquisition. Real work. Real partnership. The kind of respect that came from demonstrating competence rather than demanding recognition. On my way, she typed. Somewhere, Sebastian was learning that prisons were louder than penthouses. That losing everything taught lessons wealth never could. That the person you dismissed as decorative might have been the only thing holding up the ceiling. But that was his story now. Evelyn had moved on to writing her own. She grabbed her briefcase, took one last look at the harbor, and headed to the boardroom. There was work to do. Empires to build. And this time, she'd be the one signing her name to the foundation. Outside, it started to rain. The kind that washed things clean and made space for something new. Evelyn smiled and stepped into the elevator that led up instead of down. The doors closed on a woman who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was reconstruction. And that sometimes, you had to be discarded to discover what you were actually worth. The laughter had stopped. The empire had fallen. And the woman he'd thrown away was finally, truly free. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.